Welcome to part 3 of how to make an MMO. Today I'll be talking about protocols, prediction models, and hacking. So, the first thing I'll say, for your servers you'll need to use overlapping I/O. This is a technique used by operating systems to allow you to efficiently retrieve data on multiple threads without having, a billion threads. And what it means is just you have a few threads that can handle multiple I/Os. For your protocol, you want to use UDP. You do not want to use TCP. You just want to use UDP, and then you want to make your own reliable message system on top of that. There is a few reasons, but the primary reason is that you have more control when you use UDP. You don't have to uh, specify timeouts and such. You can determine when you disconnect your client. Um, and it's a message system. It has a little, yeah. You don't, you you might want some of your communication to be non-reliable, and so at that point you want to use UDP, and it's just easier to just have everything UDP, and then make your own reliable message system on top of that, and then you can determine if your message needs to be reliable or not. And this is actually what Steam does, and they have some libraries you can use for that. If you're indie and you don't want to make your own, you might look into that. Not that I advise indies to make MMOs. Um, there are some prediction models I want to talk about. So, you know, you usually just use a prediction model that is each thing that moves has a speed, and you just update each frame with that speed. Maybe it also has an acceleration, and then you apply that acceleration, and then the client will do that, and the server will do that, and then the server sends the results to the client. And then you'll get really jagged movement. So what you do is you smooth out the movement over a few frames, and then things will look pretty good. But you might still have some weird edge cases where if players suddenly stop, then for the client it'll look like they run forward and then backward. But uh, those are pretty difficult to get around those problems. It does have some downsides though. The thing is, you don't know anything else than the physics systems in these classic models, and so you're not going to be able to have your AI do stuff around you, and um, you have to make sure that the animations that you send from the server to the client are the correct ones and such. What I would advise more is just have the client and server share an update loop, meaning what they calculate is the exact same thing. This means that the client knows all the game code, right? Um, and when you do that, you get around like, hey, when should I play the animation frame and stuff like that, because the client knows from the state of the world. Um, and when you do that, you just have the server send the result every update loop and then override whatever the client had. And then you can still apply some smoothing on physics objects so it doesn't get jagged. And you just have special cases for that. And you can even diff the result, so the client knows what the previous state was, and what the new state is, and so you only send the difference in that. You don't send the entire new state of the world. Um, yeah, and about the client needing to know the game code, if you're scared about that, you might not want to do it this way, because you might be scared that people can copy your game or something. Um, It also leads to more computing on the client side, and it has a tendency to use more bandwidth because now the client needs to know all the states about all the NPCs and all the stuff, right? Um, I also want to get into some tips and tricks you can use to make your game feel more responsive. And so if you have some setup animation frames on your animation, so like a player uses a spell, and then what you want to do is, as soon as the player hits that spell, it sends the message. And then a few frames later, the spell gets used. And those frames you then have to do your communication. And that means if you know the latency of from your client, you can deduct the latency from whatever how many animation frames you had. Meaning if you have like 80 milliseconds of setup time, you have 80 milliseconds of latency, and then those two would cancel, and the server would just recognize that the button is actually sorry, not the button, but the spell is active now, not because it was pressed 80 milliseconds ago. Yeah, that's a way you can do stuff. If you have random numbers in your game, how do you handle that? And well, that depends heavily on your game. What you could do is you could share seed between your game and your client. Sorry, your server and your client. Um, and that's great if it's okay for the client to know what the outcome will be. If that is not okay, then the server should determine the output. And what you definitely don't want to do is you don't want to make the client determine the output. That would be a way to open up for hacking. Um, you might do data compression on the data that you send out if you have a limited bandwidth. Um, what you're actually doing there is you're trading CPU power for bandwidth because you both have to compress the data and decompress the data once it gets to the client. And so both sides have to do more computing. But that might be very worth. And it very much depends on what data you send. Some data can be compressed heavily and some cannot. So if you are worried about cheating in your game, I will start by saying this. There will always be some way to cheat, at least a little bit. One of the ways you could do something is by having the server ask to hash your game with some random number and then look at what comes out. The problem with that is it's pretty easy to get around. You just need to change the source code a little bit. And so that's a little annoying, right? Um, yeah. Uh, Something else that people usually do is they hook into your game. So every time you call a function, you won't call the function you think you did. You will call some other thing. And hooking allows for wall hacks and aimbots and such stuff. Um, and in some games that's not important, and maybe you just allow hooking because maybe you can use to do modding or something cool that's not necessarily harmful for your game. And you can do kernel mode drivers that to to limit the amount of hacking that the players can do, but so can the players. So you're always at a disadvantage here. Um, and usually many of these problems come from dynamic linking and virtual function pointers. And so if you do static linking and you optimize a lot of your function calls away and you don't have virtual function pointers, it gets a little more difficult because now you have to change the source code. But still, uh, game you can have hackers that just create an emulation of your game. So from the server side, it looks like it is the game, uh, but in reality, it isn't. It's just some different program. So you should always uh, treat your clients as if they had the source code to your game, because they essentially at some point do. Um, and even when you think about all that, you can still just have external things like something is hooked up to the computer that acts like a human, or something is hooked up to the computer that has a DMA access. And once you have that on, you just have no way of detecting that, and you have no way of preventing hacks. And so there's a great guy on YouTube I'll like to point out. His name is Cass, and there's a link in the corner there you can look up. So uh, one of the most important thing is you should not rely on client-side evaluation for most things. There are some things that you need to do it for, like movement. you don't want the client to be forced to walk different places by the server. You want the client to tell the server where it is. Um, but you can limit the amount of hacking that is allowed there. So, like fly hacking and speed hacking, uh, if the server does the update loop, it can check if those movements that are made by the client is even possible. If there aren't, it can roll back to whatever it thinks is correct. Um, if you have an FPS, you might think about, well, is it the client or the server that determines whether or not you hit an enemy? Um, it could be the client, actually, and some games do this, like Overwatch, they do this. Um, this allows you to have aimbots, or auto aim or whatever, and hit through walls and such. So you have to be sure that your game isn't hooked into, or you might just want to make it very difficult for cheaters to hook into your game. Uh, you can also have your client evaluate whether or not it got hit. That's If you do that, then you will be exposed to a different kind of hack, which is just a hack where you'll never be able to be hit. You can just dodge everything. Um, and then there's some things you definitely don't want your clients to be able to have control over, and that's things like trading, your inventory, and whether or not you critically hit or such. And amazingly, some new MMOs actually don't get this right. I believe New World had a bug where clients could create money out of nothing because they had the authority to determine what was in their inventory. Yeah, don't do that, right? And so I will have a final part of this series, which is some final comments uh, on these talks I had. So thank you for watching.